Okay, so let's go ahead and work on our second image idea. I'm going to create a new document. And since we just created the document size we need, which is 300 ppi, 8.25 by 10.75 inches, that is in our recent items list. So I can just select that and click create. Okay, so for this second idea, what I'm going to do is combine this image of a dollar bill with this image that I found on Unsplash of kind of a courthouse or some sort of government building. So what I want to do is place the dollar bill where this brick wall is, sort of behind those pillars. And that's going to create a really jarring, kind of weird, conceptual image. And again, this is appropriate for a news magazine because maybe it's some sort of criticism of government and money's influence in government. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and drag this image into our document. And I'm going to resize it so it is the right size for our magazine. We just sort of bring it down just a bit. There we go. I want the top of the pillars. Okay, so I think that that is an important part of the image. So let's make sure we capture that. Okay, but we also want to capture this person because having a person in the shot is going to bring a lot of life to it. So I selected this shot partially because of that person sort of walking there. Okay, so we need to cut out this image. So let me start by creating a copy of our background layer, and I could do that by, or actually not our background layer, but of our base image. I'm gonna hit Command J to do that. Okay, and then let me use the pen tool to create a cutout of this sort of background area. Okay, so I'm gonna grab the pen tool. I can get to that by clicking P, and then let me just go in here and make a quick selection here. Okay, so I've selected sort of this first area with the pen tool. I'm going to just kind of keep going here and selecting the rest of this area. And since I'm sort of working within that same path, I can just keep going and it's going to add to that path. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go around here and I'm going to avoid this little top area. Okay, so there's a little bit of sort of a molding at the top where the brick area meets the top of the architecture. I'm going to select that out because I think, having the dollar bill just go in the flat spot is going to look the best. So I'm going to work around that, and then I'm going to continue to make my path for all of these areas. Okay, so I've gone through and made all those selections using the pen tool. I just paused to do it really quick so that the video didn't get too long. If you need help using the pen tool, you can go back and watch that video from last week. But yep, I've just gone through and selected all those areas. And I've also selected around the actual figure, including these little zones where his arm is kind of creating a hole. That hole needs to be cut out as well. Okay, so now that I've created that path, go to the paths area and make sure to rename our work path to the cutout. Okay, because remember, if we just keep it as the work path, we might accidentally replace it if we create a new path. So the cutout will make sure that we sort of retain that information no matter what. Okay, so let's go ahead and zoom out just a bit. And then let's make a selection out of our cutout. So we can do that by right-clicking or control-clicking, going down to Make Selection. And based on that path, 0.5 pixels is probably pretty good. We'll make a new selection. Then we can go back over to Layers, and we can actually cut out one of these layers from their background. Okay, so you can see now I have a mask here, and if I turn off all the other layers, you can see that this mask is making it so that only the part of the background is visible. Okay, so that's exactly what we want. We're going to go ahead and put our dollar bill in there next, but we've got our sort of regular background layer, and then we have our cutout of just those zones where we want the dollar bill to sit. Okay, so let's turn that back on. Let's go ahead and drag our image of the dollar bill into our image here. There we go. And I found this dollar bill on Wikipedia. They have a really high resolution scan, so it's going to work perfect for this. Okay, so I'm just going to loosely put this into the right size. We're going to have to warp it into perspective. Okay, so I'm just going to get it about right. That looks pretty good. Click OK. And then if I turn down the opacity of this layer, it's going to help us see sort of where we need to kind of place this thing. We also have a choice of what part of the dollar bill we want to show. I think the Benjamin Franklin is a pretty iconic part, but also showing, you know, the 100 is probably good too. So maybe it's somewhere in here, or maybe we just use the end. I think I like kind of the middle because, you know, this image of the $100 bill is so iconic that honestly, no matter where we place it, it's probably going to be pretty recognizable, but I kind of like getting the Benjamin Franklin in there. Okay, so in order to kind of transform this into the right space, there's a few tools that we could use. One that you might play around with a little bit is the perspective warp. Okay, so perspective warp allows you to make changes, and those changes sort of follow the rules of perspective. Okay, so that might help in this particular situation because we are sort of trying to place this bill into perspective, and you can see I can sort of, you know, use these tools to start to imitate the slanted angle of the photograph. Okay, but I think a more easy way to do this, and I'm just going to go ahead and click cancel rather than apply to just sort of undo that, is instead to use just the regular distort tool. Okay, so the distort tool is pretty similar, but instead of working with the rules of perspective, I can just go ahead and make any changes I want. And, you know, I can tell by the way this perspective is going that I kind of want these lines on the inside to kind of converge in, and then the lines on the outside to kind of converge out. So I'm going to follow the kind of lines of the actual image and start to replicate, you know, where this dollar needs to fall. Okay, so I'm just sort of moving that point up and down. And part of this is just kind of eyeballing it in. Okay, but I want that to follow the line at the top of the courthouse. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of move that into place. There we go, and that looks pretty good. Probably something about like that. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to click check. Okay, and then if I make this 100%, you can see it is in position, but obviously we need to put it behind the pillars. And we also need it to match the lighting a little bit more. Okay, so one way we can do this is actually just clip it to the actual underlying layer. And that's because, you know, when we create a clipping mask, we are sort of constraining this object to what happens underneath. So, you know, same thing that we were using for the adjustment layers, you can create a clipping mask between two layers, and the top layer is going to clip and constrain itself to the layer that's underneath. So this is the layer that's underneath. This layer is the dollar bill, and it's going to constrain itself to just where that underlying layer is. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Another simple way to do it would be to copy this layer mask. Okay, so if I go ahead and copy that layer mask by holding down Option, I can drag it into this dollar, and now the dollar has that same layer mask, and that layer mask is preventing the dollar from sort of being in places where we don't want it to be. So now it's sort of sitting in the right zone again. Okay, so that looks pretty good. In order to get the lighting into this scene, we're going to want to set this to multiply. Okay, so I'm going to set the dollar itself to multiply. And this is working really well because our underlying layer has kind of a pretty light background. And so the multiply is going to help incorporate all the shadow detail into that area. Okay, and I'm getting also all the the lines of the brick. I actually think that's a pretty cool look. If you didn't want those lines, you'd have to take some time to kind of clean all that up. But in this case, I kind of like how the dollar bill feels like it's sort of painted over the masonry of the actual image. So I feel like that is working pretty well. It's a little bit dark in the background. Okay, so one thing we can do is kind of lighten up that background just a bit. Because remember that this dollar bill is sitting on this layer. Okay, this layer is kind of the background for the dollar bill. And so if I lighten up this middle layer, I can do that by creating a levels adjustment. And then of course creating a clipping mask. Okay, remember you can also do that by holding down Option and clicking the line between the two layers. That's going to constrain this adjustment to just the layer underneath. So I can bring that adjustment up a bit. That's going to create a little bit of sort of a lighter zone for this to sit on. So you can see if I turn this off and on, just lightening up that dollar bill a little bit. And I actually think I went a little too far. So I want it to be light, but I want it to sort of incorporate that lighting from the underlying scene. Okay, so this looks really good. Again, we've created some sort of conceptual image. This is ready to go for our second concept. And the last step is applying our mesh head to these image concepts that we've created.